Magic is found in every room, where people connect over a shared purpose. In this weekly podcast, Luke, Hannah and Chris explore the role of purpose, courage, mindset and culture in every leader's quest for transformational performance.
Hello and welcome to Magic in the Room. I am Hannah Broderud.
And I'm Luke Freeman. And today we are continuing our conversation on this month's theme of survival strategies. So we're pretty excited about this one. We had a great introductory conversation about survival strategies previously this month, and we talked about the ways that our brain either seeks a reward or tries to avoid harm, and that seeking that reward, avoiding harm, creates all of these strategies. Sometimes we're predisposed to some, but we talked about fight, flight, freeze, appease, had a great conversation. And if you haven't listened to that one yet, I suggest that might be a great place to catch up before jumping into this. And also, as a reminder, there is a free download about survival strategies at magicintheroom.com. Just like every month in this season, you can go there, you can download the guide and follow along, reflect a little bit as we go through this content and apply it to you in your leadership role and journey. Hannah, any kind of key takeaways from our previous conversations about survival strategies before we jump into today's topic?
Well, we talked a little bit about what stress is and different types of stress, right? And I think that's helpful just for context. Like, what do we mean by stress? Luke, what's your definition of stress? How would you kind of, what are situations in which we would have to deploy a survival strategy?
Okay, so I'll give you a nerdy answer. I define stress as situations where I don't have the skill or the tools to respond to what my environment is asking of me. So that could be relationally something that's happening. That could be technically something that's happening. Could be conceptually, or it could just even be like the amount of work or information that needs to be dealt with or processed. If I don't have the resource to meet the demand, stress is the outcome. And it could be I don't have a coping mechanism. It could be I don't have the time. It could be I don't have clear priorities. But if I don't have the resource I need to meet the demands, then stress is what I experience.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a helpful way to think about it, right? In our previous episode, we also talked about 3 different types of stress. And, we talked about like positive stress, which are things that are maybe they're even fun or exciting, like when we're learning new things that feel like a positive thing, but they can take a toll on us in different ways, right? They impact our energy levels and things like that. Anything where you kind of expend a lot of energy, it can be stressful on the body or the mind, but it can be experienced in a positive way. And then we used a couple of other terms when we talked about that. I'm going to give just a slightly different way to think about it. You can think about acute stress, chronic stress, or episodic acute stress. Acute stress is something that's like happens immediately. It's about a specific situation that's happening, right? Some kind of like we're really worried, we have a deadline, right? That's a typical example of acute stress. And it could be positive, it could be negative. Then you have chronic stress. That's when it gets kind of like, if you have high levels of chronic stress over time, that really is what wreaks havoc on your system, right? And sometimes we call that toxic stress. Things where I think there are lower levels of chronic stress and there can be really high toxic levels of chronic stress. But kind of what identifies it is that we don't see necessarily a way out. Like we don't have a lot of hope that it's going to end. And those are kind of dangerous forms of stress, right? And then you have episodic acute stress, which could be, again, like maybe it's a reoccurring deadline, or it's something that happens at certain intervals. But again, it's tolerable. So we talked about tolerable stress and toxic stress in our last episode. It's tolerable because you know it's going to end, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you have this kind of hope, like, yeah, it might happen again, but I know it has a limit to it. These are just different ways of thinking about stress, right? And the different types of stress that we experience. We all experience stress, and some amount of stress is important for growth, for any kind of growth or learning to happen, right? Some kind of discomfort, tension, pressure is important for most of the things that really make life worth living, right? But what we really want to pay attention to is how we respond in those situations and how we take care of ourselves so we don't get under this kind of chronic stress where it really wreaks havoc on our both our mind and body and our emotions, right?
Yeah, there's I'll get a little philosophical here. I mean, with stress, it feels like it kind of goes back to that moderation is the rule type of principle for life. And if we have zero stress, we're probably not progressing, because if I don't ever find myself in situations where the demands of the situations are a little bit more than what I've already got, knowledge or tool wise, then I'm probably not going to grow and develop. But if I experience that all the time, or in really traumatic ways, little t or big T, or chronically traumatic ways, that's obviously not helpful either. So I think when we think about stress, some moderation can be really helpful for us. And today we want to move forward with the conversation and really talk about how do we manage it, because stress is a rule of life. Hopefully we're not all experiencing unhealthy, toxic amounts of stress consistently, but we are going to experience some amount of extreme stress from time to time. And even moderate stress, it's helpful for us to know how to basically deal with it, consume it, digest it, grow, move forward. And today we're going to talk about what are called the 4 C's. And these are just a bit of a framework to help us handle stressful situations, move forward, metabolize stress, maybe if we want to use that metaphor, and grow because of it, or at least be able to mitigate the harm of even toxic stress and move forward in a productive way. So, Hannah, do you want to just give us just some background on the 4 C's? Where did these come out of? What work did these come out of? And how did we get from there to applying them to handling stress in a leadership role?
Yeah, exactly. So the 4 C's is just a simple way to remember these 4 concepts: calm, contain, care, and cope. And we're going to dive into each of those separately. But the 4 C's really come from trauma-informed care, which is really born out of the healthcare space, right? So, and it's about recognizing the difficult emotional experiences that people have had in their past. So it could be traumatic events, it could be stressful events that people have experienced, whether it's little t trauma or big T trauma, and being cognizant of that as a leader. And right, so this framework that started in healthcare has been applied to leadership, and we call it trauma-informed leadership, where the leader is really aware of the fact that people in our care have experienced difficult things. And so often when we see a reaction that seems disproportionate to the situation at hand, we can be pretty confident that that person has experienced something in their past that makes them react in a way that's out of proportion for how maybe you would react in a similar situation, right? And being mindful of that helps us have more compassion with that person. And then because we're talking about self-leadership here in this season as well, that applies to ourselves as well, right? When we notice that we are reacting in a way that maybe seems disproportionate to what happened, getting curious about that and really gain awareness of what's happening, we can ask ourselves some different questions and maybe apply some more compassion to ourselves if we recognize that maybe what we're responding to is not this particular situation, it's what happened to me a long time ago and that I didn't have any control over. And now there's a reaction coming because of that, right? And so that's kind of a little bit of background on the 4Cs, but also kind of why this is a helpful framework when we recognize ourselves or others having a strong reaction to a stressful situation.
Yeah. And just a couple days ago, I spent some time with a medical doctor who has spent a big chunk of his career in pediatric emergency medicine. And we pretty quickly got to this part in our conversation where we were talking about the role of emotional intelligence in providing excellent medical care. And, he was very adamant on this point that the technicals of medicine only get you so far. And what he looks for in other doctors, if he's looking for folks to work alongside him or partner with, he really looks for folks who have really started to play that second game of emotional work, understanding that there's an emotional aspect to providing medical care, because they're going to be the ones that really help patients find the best outcomes. And you can imagine if you're spending time, doing emergency pediatrics, there's a lot of how do I connect to this child? How do I connect to this family that's experiencing something very stressful? And as we go into the 4Cs, I think remembering that applies to all of us is helpful. So even though we're not maybe saving lives, a lot of us have come from scenarios where we've maybe learned the technicals of our trade, but we haven't been taught, how do I actually deal with people who are experiencing stressful or traumatic situations while I'm also doing my technical work? And I mean, that's the scenario he found himself in and day out. So taking something like the 4Cs as a guide for us as we learn how to engage on the emotional work of being a leader, I think is helpful. So let's jump in. The first of the 4Cs, as you mentioned, Hannah, is calm. So walk us through, like, what is the calm step and how do we as leaders really start with calming when we're managing stressful situations?
Yeah. So calm is, we have lots of ways to think about that. And I think we all know what calm feels like, but there's an active and intentional way of creating calm, right? So once we're in a situation where we're triggered or somebody else has been triggered by some kind of event, right? Any kind of stressful event, the first step is to first practice self-awareness, right? Become aware of how we're reacting or what's rising to the surface. Become aware that we are in a reactive state, or the other individual or the team, right? And so pay attention to what we're actually feeling and try to even label the emotion that we're feeling. That's a really helpful way to kind of emotional self-management, because what happens is emotional intensity is part of the limbic. It's driven or regulated by the limbic system in the brain. And specifically in the amygdala is the intensity of emotion. So we often call that an amygdala hijack when we become flooded by emotion, right? And when we are feeling strongly, we are not thinking clearly. So by labeling the emotion and getting curious about what exactly am I feeling and trying to put a name on it, you're activating the prefrontal cortex and you're switching some of the activity in the brain to the frontal lobe, which means there's less activity, less blood flow, less intensity in the back of the brain in the amygdala, right? And so we can begin to start feeling calmer if we're thinking clearly, right? And then we have lots of different techniques like breathing exercises, practicing active relaxation or grounding techniques. Physical movement is super helpful for helping to remain calm. Sometimes we need to like physically remove ourselves from the situation. My partner called me yesterday morning and just needed to vent. Like he's having a stressful morning and he's feeling himself getting reactive with the team. And he's like, I just needed to walk away from the job site. I'm not in a good mental state right now. And like he had to physically remove himself for a little while until he could like regain calm so he wasn't affecting the team's energy, right? With how he was feeling. And I think as a leader, that's a responsibility that we have. And then we can practice words like calm, let go. I sometimes, when I feel myself getting really anxious or worried about a particular thing that I can't control, I do a little physical practice. And if you're listening to this, I'm kind of demonstrating, but I act like I'm holding something in my hand and I open my hand and I physically release the thing and I picture it kind of just like falling to the ground. Like I'm not holding on to it anymore. I'm just letting it go. And that can help. That's a technique that I use sometimes to calm my mind. Luke, any other ideas? Like what are some things that you use for creating calm?
Yeah. So a lot of it is just taking that deep breath and just taking a moment to prepare, knowing that we're going into a stressful situation or that we're getting ready to manage a stressful situation. So I do have a little bit of, wilderness medical first aid experience, led trips for quite a while and was the person responsible for safety. And whenever an accident happens, or even being a parent, when an accident happens, I have 3 boys, like injuries aren't uncommon. Before walking into the other room, when you hear the scream or when you hear the yell or hear like, Dad, just kind of like stopping, taking a breath, and then not running, but you got to get there quick, right? But not putting yourself into a state of overwhelm, like managing yourself first so you can actually be as helpful as possible. And I think the good thing about this calm step is that it's totally learnable and can totally become a habit. And so if you go to first aid training, I mean, they talk about that there are steps to providing first aid or to providing CPR. And the first one is often around how do I manage myself and stay calm? Hey, you go call for help. How do I anchor to the process? Right. And anchoring to a process is actually a calming step, so that you are removing yourself from that point of emergency or point of stress and saying, I'm here to help. I'm a helper. I'm not an experiencer of the stress. So the good news is I think as we practice this, it can become a habit.
Yeah.
And I think that moves us to our second step, the second C, which is contain. So we've gotten ourselves in the right headspace, right? And now the next step is to contain this situation to make sure that things will not get worse. So if we have, let's say, an employee come to us and they're incredibly stressed out, and they say, something happened with my partner relationship. I have to move. I'm not going to be able to pay my mortgage. Something happened with one of my kids. I just heard they were in an accident, right? There's all sorts of things that come to us. And our job, once we've calmed, is to contain. And when I think about containing, it really is about making sure that whatever this is, whatever this stressful or traumatic situation is that now has walked into my office or that has called me on the phone, my job is to contain and make sure that that is not going to be a contagion that spreads and gets worse, impacts more people. So in a literal first aid scenario, it's, hey, is there some environmental thing that I need to contain to make sure this doesn't get worse? I'm not going to step out into the middle of the road to help someone who's hurt if there's a chance I'm going to get hit by a car. I'm not going to go say, hey, grab that person who just got electrocuted and you get electrocuted yourself if there's that risk. So first I'm going to contain and make sure that things won't get worse. And so one technique is creating a safe space. So are we in a safe space to give care? Are we in a safe space to respond to this? If we're not, let's get to a safe space. If someone runs into your place of business and says, help, someone's chasing me, someone's following me, right? What are you going to do? You're going to go lock the door. Do we have a safe space that we can respond to this in a measured, helpful way? That might be a psychologically safe space. Okay, this is a big deal. Let me get someone else in here who can kind of be a third party and help us work through this. What is it that I need to do to keep it from getting worse? Another thing we can do is just acknowledge and validate what's going on. Hey, it sounds like there's something really stressful. Sounds like there's something that's potentially traumatic. This is going to take a while for us to talk through. Let's just like validate that and not think that we're going to be able to say 2 sentences and fix it. Another thing is to offer choice and control. Would you like to talk about this now? Should we schedule a time to talk about this? You tell me what you need. Hey, do you need to just go deal with this? Like, go deal with it. I've got your back. I'll cover things here. Go deal with it. And then let's group up tonight or tomorrow or a week from now. So really offering people some level of choice to mitigate the problem. And then another thing is oftentimes stressful situations aren't about an accident or a traumatic thing. Sometimes they're about conflict. So maybe it's like someone walks in and they're like, oh my gosh, I've had it with Bill. If he says another thing to me, I'm going to blow up and explode. Right? Well, can we reframe that a little bit and say, okay, I hear that you are at your limit. I am very curious about what led us to this point. It's going to take me a while to really understand your perspective. Let's go grab some coffee. Let's get into that safe space. But I want to reframe any sort of frustration, intensity as fascination and curiosity. How can I learn more about this and get us into a space where we can really contain it? I mean, and the last thing I'll say about this is worst case scenarioing it is helpful to contain stress. So, okay, I hear that things are really stressful, or even managing myself. I'm feeling a lot of stress about a deadline, about a relationship, about a conflict I'm having with someone, about a financial situation, whatever it is that is really triggering stress in us. Okay, what's the worst that could happen? And, I've been in situations in my life where, and I'm just going to use financial as an example. Okay, I'm really stressed about finances. What's the worst thing that could happen? Like, I might have to not go out to eat for a couple months. I might have to sell a vehicle and go down a vehicle in our household. Like, what else? What else is worst case scenario? And once I've identified that, and let's say it's like bad, worst case, we might lose our house. Okay, what would we do? We would have to go live with like a parent. Okay, like that's worst case scenario. All right. If that happens, will we survive? Like, yes, we'll survive. Do we really want to avoid that? Yes, we really want to avoid that. Okay. Well, at least we kind of know the stakes that we're playing with. And depending on how big those stakes are, we're going to know how much attention should we give to this stressful situation. So I really think that worst case scenarioing it makes a lot of sense. I think this is where we really know who else we need to pull in. If I'm in a business setting and I worst case scenario it, I want to know that I need to bring legal counsel in early rather than finding out later that I should have brought in legal counsel. If I need to bring in HR, if I need to bring in a third party to help me think through a technical issue, a cyber security issue, right? So worst case scenarioing it gives us the ability to contain early rather than letting harmful or stressful things balloon and balloon and balloon.
Yeah. And I think that's, doing that puts us kind of back in control, right? Because now we're proactively thinking about scenarios, taking ownership of our response, recognizing that we have choices. We can choose responses if we can put ourselves in that space where we're being intentional about it, right? And because I think a lot of some of the most stressful things in our lives are the things that we feel like we have no control over, right? If we feel like we don't have control. So, I mentioned deadlines earlier. I used to have a pretty pathological fear of deadlines because it felt like something that I couldn't control, right? And which is totally not true because I can control what I do to meet the deadline, right? But that required me getting in the space, and it's a little different now because I do own my own business. I set my own deadline. Now, some things are dictated by client needs and things like that, but I have a very different experience of that because I chose to be in this situation. I get to choose to have these deadlines or these things. So I don't feel stressed out about it in the same way, right? And I think there's something in resilience that allows us to recognize that we have a choice in how we respond to a certain situation. And that, I think, helps to contain this stress load of the situation. And I did a very similar exercise. I like to think of these as games. Our good friend Lorca, who's been on the podcast a couple times, she thinks of resilience games, right? So the worst case scenario is a game for me, right? It's not a natural, for me, I tend to be more of a silver lining, look for the positives kind of person. But when I was about to take the step of leaving the relative security of corporate job with salary and benefits, and was kind of considering taking this plunge into starting a business and operating independently, I went through exactly that, right? What's the worst case scenario? What's the worst that could happen if I do this? Well, the worst that could happen for me was that I wasn't making any money. And then what would I do? I would just go take a job again. Like it wasn't that big a deal when I leaned into that fear and put myself there and recognized, okay, well, I can get myself out of that situation. I can always take another job again if I had to. Do I want to? No. So what are things I can do to make sure to set myself up for success? Right.
Yeah. Okay. So calm. We've contained. Step number 3, care.
Yeah. And care is really, I think, the hallmark of this whole approach, right? Because that's our intention, to take care of the people that we lead, but also take care of ourselves, right? So watch out for the well-being of the individual, of the team, or if we're the one experiencing a stressful situation, right? How can we care for ourselves, make sure that we meet the needs that we have in the situation to manage it, right? And so that starts with compassion, connecting with compassion and non-judgment. That means that all feelings are valid. Every feeling that we're having, whether we agree with the reaction of someone else or not, is irrelevant. What they are feeling is what they're feeling, and that experience is real to them and it's valid. Same for us. Every feeling that we're having, there's, not shaming ourselves for having a reaction, I think is really important in this step. And then, Luke, you already kind of alluded to this in the previous step, but leading with curiosity and wonder. It's like, I wonder what's going on for them right now, or I wonder what this person really needs right now, or what do I really need and desire in this moment? What would help me feel like I'm cared for in this situation? And that's really what self-care, like real self-care, is about, right? It's not about like these tactics that we do to make ourselves feel better. It's to like really ask, what do I really need? What do I really, really need? And make sure that we're responsive to our own needs as well as the needs of the people that we lead. Another kind of hallmark of trauma-informed care is to destigmatize harmful behaviors. So often, we've learned these coping mechanisms ways to respond to stress that are not always helpful, right? We have strategies that are helpful and ones that are not helpful, and we've learned them for a reason. There's a reason we do them, and it's because our brain has interpreted that this has kept us safe in the past, right? So destigmatizing harmful behaviors. So, I had a conversation. I was in a HR community meeting just this week, and they had some representatives from an organization that help people deal with different behavioral health issues, but specifically substance abuse and alcoholism and also mental health challenges. And so we have this kind of open conversation. And one of the biggest things that kind of resonated with me is, when you have someone that is truly an alcoholic, for example, and that can be a harmful behavior that is unhealthy, but recognizing that the bottle is the solution for them. The bottle is not the problem. The bottle is the solution, right? And because there's something going on internally, and that is the solution. Now, it may not be the most helpful solution, right? So I think being able to recognize that everyone does, we will do almost anything to avoid pain. And sometimes that means we adopt harmful coping mechanisms, harmful behaviors. And so destigmatizing it means we acknowledge it, we recognize that it is what feels like a solution. It is a coping mechanism. It is a survival strategy. And ask the question, not ask the question, what's wrong with you? And same with ourselves, right? If we're recognizing that we're engaging in some kind of coping activity mechanism that's not helpful, ask what happened to you. And we've alluded to this before, right? What happened? What is it that's really going on the inside? What is it we're really trying to get away from? That can help have more compassion and approach the situation in a way that's not going to alienate the individual that we're working with, even if that's ourselves.
Yeah. And I think this step, care, is really one that gets skipped pretty often. When we have a stressful situation come up in our own lives or in the lives of others, oftentimes we'll move, maybe we even calm ourselves and do some containing, but then we skip to the fourth, which is cope, and we go right to making a response plan rather than connecting in a human way with whoever's experiencing the stress or traumatic experience. And it's important to remember that before we jump to action, unless it truly is life or death, we really need to be connecting on a human level if we're going to be as effective as possible. And, at the beginning, when I shared the story of this pediatric emergency physician, that was his whole point, is that if we don't skip care, like really connecting on a human level, our response plan is going to be much more effective. When we get to coping, we're going to have enough of a relationship with the people that we're trying to help that they trust us. They can give us feedback. That plan won't work because of this. Or, hey, 3 other doctors have told me that, and here's what happened, right? And when they trust us enough to provide us that feedback, we can really collaborate and do something that will work. So whether that's around conflict, whether it's around financial stress, whatever, like, let's take a moment, talk about the human need that's at the core of it, and then we can go to step 4, which is cope. So we'll do that now. So what is coping? That's what a lot of us who are technical experts, what to do. We want to make a response plan. We want to fix the cause of the stress. And just a couple things to remember when we do get to cope is that we want to draw on our own strengths. We want to draw on the strengths of the people that we're working with. Mitigating weaknesses or trying to do things differently than what folks' strengths actually are is not as effective as using strengths. So if someone comes to you and they're having a relational issue or a financial issue, and they're really stressed out about it, let's talk about like what's going well. What's something that they really know how to win at? And how could we possibly use that strength in a new way to address the cause of the stress? We want to look for hope. Hope is not just a vision of a better tomorrow, it's actually a plan for a better tomorrow. So when we can really describe what does a better tomorrow look like, where we've navigated through this stressful situation, we want to know what that looks like, but then say, what are a couple things that would have to happen that we could do to get there? We also need to focus on learning. Like, what is it? Not just that we need to do, but what is it that we need to learn to get to that better tomorrow? Oftentimes we're just like, hey, task list this out. Well, you should have just done this, this, and this. Well, people usually would have if they knew how. So there's typically a learning agenda in really managing stress and trauma that if we get that outlined and we put what do we need to learn on a piece of paper in addition to what do we need to do is much more helpful. So brainstorming is always helpful. Making a list of what could be possible solutions here. It's typically more than whatever's right on the surface. Hey, well, what do you think needs to happen to fix this stress? People are going to spout off 2 or 3 things. But if you pause for a moment and say, all right, let's brainstorm for a second. Let's get like 5 or 10 more potential solutions on the table. Oftentimes, once we get down to that 5th, 6th, 7th brainstorm idea, it's like, oh, well, I didn't think about solving it that way. And there could be something that is potentially a more effective or quicker or a little bit of a hack of a system that gets us some sort of stress mitigation without quite as much work or effort. And then like we just want to focus on resiliency. There's no stress-free life, as we talked about at the beginning. So how do we create an environment where in a conversation where people are expecting stress, ready to jump into it, ready to respond in a healthy way, and not just always running from stress, because that's not a sustainable coping response plan. Just avoiding it is not helpful. Managing it is more helpful. And, this is all just kind of generalizations. I mean, if someone's in a truly traumatic situation, if they're in an abusive relationship, if they're in a space where they truly don't have what they need to live a healthy life, we can't just say, oh, be resilience your way out of this, right? There could be large intervention needed. But in general, if we can focus on resiliency, it can be helpful. So any thoughts on coping and actually when we get to the how do we practically respond plan that have been helpful for you, Hannah?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, a big part of it is what you mentioned in the beginning of drawing on strengths. Those of us who are blessed with many years around the sun here, we recognize that we have learned a lot of tools for managing stressful events in our lives. And if we can't reflect on that, right? So if we find ourselves in one of those unforeseen big life changes that was unexpected and it kind of has us reeling, maybe feeling like the rug was pulled out from under us, taking a moment to reflect back at how I managed to get out and work through maybe different circumstances, but that kind of feeling in the past, right? What are the tools that I've learned? What are the things that I can lean on? What are the strengths that I have? And I think we are able to maybe it still feels just as hard, but we may be able to manage through it a little bit more gracefully because we've experienced hard things before. We know that we've survived this type of stress or worse in the past, and we've found a way through. We've learned some things. We're maybe even better off for it, right? And those are that's sometimes called post-traumatic growth, right? How can we grow through really stressful events? And I think that's, for me, one of the most helpful coping mechanisms is to recognize that I do have resilience. I do have strength. I have been through hard things before. I know I can do hard things. It gives agency. It gives hope, and it lets us access that inner wisdom, right? We've been here before. We can handle this too. This too shall pass. All of those are helpful phrases and strategies to help us cope through a stressful event.
Yeah. So for folks who are listening, I just want to get really practical and say, these 4 C's, if you're someone who's dealing with stress on a chronic level, it's just a part of your life as a leader. I would say, like, print this out. Go download the guide at magicintheroom.com, print out the reflection guide, create your own poster with the 4 C's, Google image search and print something out, like whatever, but get it in front of you so that you can refer to it really practically.
Yeah.
Hannah,
And make it personal, make it, personal and specific, right? Not just these generic buckets, but what works for you specifically. What are things that you learned to make, to remain calm? What are specific containing strategies that you've used or had successful with it in the past, or maybe something else that you want to try? What do you need to address in terms of care, self-care, actively caring for a team member? And then, cope. What are some strategies that we've learned that are helpful in order to cope with stress and trauma?
yeah, and I want to say too, if anyone really is experiencing a capital T trauma in your life, your job, maybe, I guess, is like, please contain it by getting help. Like,
Yeah.
take a deep breath, even listening to this and saying, who do I need to help me contain this? Whether that's legal, law enforcement, HR, whatever in your professional setting or personal life, like, do that and get some help and refer out so that you can have someone help you get to those last two: caring, coping, making a plan, changing the situation. So my big takeaway from this conversation is that this is about agency. It's about, how do I, when I experience stress, whether that's something going on in my own personal or professional life, or if it's someone that I lead that walks in the door and brings a stressful situation in with them, how do I maintain my agency over my response and how we deal with this situation? And this plan, these 4 C's, it gives me a way that I am in control, that I am making conscious choice about how to deal with and mitigate the stressful situation. And for me, a whole lot of leadership is about giving people agency. It's about, how do I take control and make conscious choice about how I'm leading, the direction my organization's going, and in today's episode, how we control and manage stressful situations. So
Yeah.
that's my takeaway. Like, if you don't feel like you have agency, use this plan to build a higher level of agency for yourself.
Yeah. And I think equally helpful in creating agency is recognizing what we can't control and actively letting go of trying to control the uncontrollable, right? So there are things that we just, if we can let go of control, we can gain more influence. And then also recognizing that I need to control the things that I can control, which are my responses and the choices that I make and the actions that I take and how I show up every day. So I would love to kind of just close us out on this quote that I love, that's so powerful, by Viktor Frankl from Man's Search for Meaning. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom.
Yeah. Great words. Hannah, you want to close us out?
Yeah, let's do this. Thank you so much for listening today. As a reminder, as Luke said, go download the guide for this episode and the series at magicintheroom.com. You can find us if you want to connect with Luke and I and our work on our website, purposeandperformancegroup.com. We're also on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram. Luke is even on TikTok. Magic in the Room is hosted by Chris Province, Hannah Broderud, and Luke Freeman. It is produced by Ben West with social media management by Emma Holland and Maggie King. Our theme music is by Evan Grimm. You can find his music on Apple Music. This episode was recorded via an online platform. Luke is in Oklahoma, Hannah is in Montana. And Magic in the Room is a production of Purpose and Performance Group. You can find us at purposeandperformancegroup.com and previous episodes at magicintheroom.com.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.